Hi, and welcome to What Kind of Internet Do You Want? I'm Amy James, and in this episode, I'm speaking with Greg Osuri. He's the co-founder of Akash, a decentralized network for cloud compute, and the CEO of Overclock Labs. My favorite thing about Greg is that he has such a pure and true love for technology, and this is evident when you hear him speak about it. And really, it's even further underscored by how he got started in tech. He learned to code as a kid in India using paper and pencil. He has an extensive career and brings a lot of experience and perspective to his work now in building Web3. In this episode, we talk about why open source is so important, how he saw the need for a cloud compute marketplace and started Akash really pre-blockchain, and what the recent explosion of AI could mean for Web3 and much more. It's a great conversation, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. But before we start, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel, and let's get into it. Hi, Greg. Welcome to What Kind of Internet Do You Want? Thanks so much for being here today.
Great to be here, Amy.
So I'm super excited to talk with you. I obviously know you personally, but I've been listening to other interviews of yours to prepare for our conversation, and you have an incredible history. So I thought to get things started, maybe you could just talk a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure, I'm the co-founder for Akash Network, and I'm the CEO for Overclock Labs. My background, being a programmer for a little over 25 years. Began programming when I was 12, I believe, 12, 13, really early, from a farm in India where we didn't have internet or computers. In fact, I learned programming without using a computer.
That's just absolutely wild. You were like writing code by hand?
Yes, I learned how to code by hand, and I would get access to a computer from a computer lab, and I would take my handwritten programs and validate them. So computers were just to validate, but you kind of needed to know how to program, without using a computer, and that laid a very strong foundation for programming for me. Compare that to the Stack Overflow based approach that we have today. Or ChatGPT or even GPT-3. I don't even write the program now. I just write the logic, and the program gets written. But yes, it's quite an evolution when you think about how my own sort of personal experience of starting to program without a computer to now using AI. It's kind of scary.
Wow, that's a really dramatic course. Yeah, but I think it just speaks to your how much you love the tech, because I know that about you just from having talked to you about it in the past. You just have this heart for it, and that you had to program without a computer, I think just illustrates that perfectly. So tell us about what you're doing with Akash.
Yeah, so to tie back, from the farm to Akash, right? So I began. It's very interesting. My experiences growing up as a programmer. A lot of the knowledge that I gained was by open source software, right? So open source was very critical for me growing up, and it became my foundation as I started my professional career with IBM and others down the line. And decentralization was a very, very incredible part growing up. I didn't realize how important it was. The fact that I could get access to knowledge without anyone's permission. It was a very permission world. If you think about it, it was Windows dominated, and all you need to buy a license and whatnot. But the open source software and the permissionless model really was a foundation for me to be where I am. Right. So it was ingrained from very early age. And long story short, I started a lot of websites, and started learning how to do websites to start to create a career, and that because I could reverse engineer a website by looking at the source code, right? So fast forward My really, Akash, the story goes back to the time when I founded Angel Hack. Angel Hack was the hackathon organization that I founded in 2011 to take hackathons to the masses. Because as growing up, a lot of the knowledge just came from books, but also came from just talking to other people that have similar interests. As a 13-year-old, hanging out with the older kids and like learning from them, hacking with them, kind of thing, that gave me a lot. So when it came to the States, I noticed a very introverted culture than what it was in India, which was very extroverted, very collaborative culture, right? So
Interesting.
bring that sort of like culture here. So that's why hackathons really were extremely attractive, to bring people together and make them have a great time, free pizza, free food, and not worry about anything and just hack for like 24 hours. So it's just very, very fun to do. So I found a lot of passion in that. And, Angel Hack grew to a ecosystem of 150,000 developers by 2013 across 50 cities around the world. It's a very successful model. And what I noticed there was a problem with how developers would deliver their workloads to the user, right? In the sense like, hey, you develop something at a hackathon, you deploy that on some platform like Heroku and whatnot. The moment you want it to scale, the moment you get decent amount of interest from your users, it becomes extremely difficult. So that's when I started focusing on improving developer experience for hyperscale systems. That evolved to a point where this thing called cloud was getting very popular, the cloud infrastructure. This is 2011, 2012 timeframe, right?
Mm-hmm.
I quickly noticed that cloud, as popular as it gets, it also limits a lot of innovation, because it was evident to me that such an important technology was getting extremely, extremely controlled by a few companies, right? And I mean, this was early. This was still pre. I mean, AWS was there, but it was still rack spaces and all these companies. But AWS was gaining such market share so rapidly, it was very scary. So our passion, was to encourage sovereignty, right? So the moment you give control to Amazon's or Google's or Microsoft of the world, you lose sovereignty, and you're at their sort of like behest in terms of cost and what you can do. And it's very clear now. It's very, very clear. If you look at like Twitter, like recently when all the finances came out, they're burning like $1.5 million a day or something on the cloud, right? Out of their 4 million burn. If you look at any of the public company filings, like Asana spends 60% of their margins on Amazon. On average, I mean, A16Z did an amazing like blog post analyzing their companies that they're on board, as well as the public companies, public data they could get. On average, half of every dollar you spend goes to Amazon, Google, and Microsoft on online services, right?
It's so crazy. It's so crazy. It just really drives home how centralized the web has become, and you started at the very beginning when it was completely the opposite, right? You had to have such intensely specialized skills to participate that it was super decentralized. And now it's become incredibly
4 companies, right? Internet is 4 companies.
Yeah.
That's all it is.
We talked about that Andreessen Horowitz report in a video. We'll link it for people if they want to check it out so they can.
It's called the $1 trillion paradox. It's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. It's wild.
And so it was very clear. I mean, this is still in 2013. It was very clear to me that an important technology like this is going to get centralized. So I formed a company called Overclock Labs in 2015 to take this really new technology called Kubernetes that no one has heard of to market, right? I was very, very early contributor to Kubernetes. Kubernetes let any cloud provider, any data center become like a cloud provider, but it was not the easiest thing to do, right? So it really needed software on top of the foundational software to make it usable. So that was the thesis of Overclock Labs. Now, as we were deploying,
So I have a
software.
question at this point because I couldn't tell in the other interviews that I listened to. You got started thinking about Overclock Labs and what Akash ultimately would become before you were thinking about trying to make some sort of blockchain project. Do I have that right?
Correct. This is pre-blockchain. In the sense, I mean, again, like remove the blockchain, but it was very decentralized system, right? Without formalizing the name blockchain, when we founded Overclock, we wanted to take Kubernetes to market, but with a value prop that the cloud couldn't deliver, right? Because anytime you introduce a new product, you want to have exponential value instead of marginal value.
Mm-hmm.
So the exponential value this Overclock would provide is edge computing. In the sense, like if you had a data center, any data center across the world, we would turn the data center into a cloud provider, and in a way that would improve your performance to the end user by reducing the latency. That means by reducing the distance, between the device and the cloud, you can improve performance, right? And in order to reduce distance, you need to be able to deploy your applications close to the user. And that's a very difficult thing to do, especially at scale, especially if you have 100 data centers. So we had that tech, we were developing the tech. And one of the key properties for this edge computing to function is these individual edge cloud nodes need to operate without a centralized failure point, or else it's not going to work, right? It's called optimistic scheduling. And so we developed a decentralized sort of like peer-to-peer mechanism for these nodes to sort of like, synchronize themselves, stay up to date, as well as, deploy applications, right? So we built like this quasi blockchain using a Merkle tree-based, Git-based sort of like, data structure, using for data integrity, and using BitTorrent-based replication mechanism. So when you put BitTorrent and Git together, you end up with the blockchain. So we kind of built a blockchain without even realizing blockchain kind of thing. This is in 2015, right? So this is like way, way before. I mean, blockchain was getting there. This is pre-Ethereum days. This is, actually someone told me about Ethereum in 2015. Then I started looking at it. I'm like, okay, this makes more sense. Like Ethereum kind of is doing what we're trying to do. And then we kind of like built an early prototype in Ethereum before that, right? So before pre-Ethereum, what we discovered was as we were deploying our software to a lot of these data centers, we discovered most of the compute is not used. Like 85% of the time, a data center is not used.
Yeah, that's wild.
Yeah, because
yeah, that's so wild. But what was the incentive for it to be used before you guys, when you were just doing the Kubernetes, BitTorrent, whatever kind of thing?
For the data centers?
Or for what was the business model to keep the decentralized system functioning? Because like there have been decentralization isn't necessarily new to blockchain. It's more just that it's incentivized, and so it's reliable now, right? Like BitTorrent has been around forever, but it was unreliable, I guess you could say.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So we were closed source software. I mean, we were not open source before crypto or before like blockchain. We were closed source. So we were charging license like a traditional software company.
Makes sense.
That didn't work out really well. I'll tell you, because infrastructure being closed source is a very, very hard sell, especially in this day and age, right? So it was a wrong model, and we wanted to. We realized as open source people, we had to go back to our roots as open source devs, right? So one of the reasons we wanted, and we were looking at how do you really make this sustainable? How do you create open source software and not like fall under the open code trap where you have traditional models where half your software is free, half your software is paid. We didn't like that model. We wanted to create a truly open source software and truly sustainable. That's when the crypto and the token side came way later though. But we began with just understanding that most compute that was like we were deploying to was not used, and so that's the idea for a marketplace came about. And we were looking at this marketplace. How do you really like create a truly open source marketplace that's when like crypto, the tokenized component came on top of the blockchain. So now you add tokens on the blockchain, it became like a full crypto company. This is in a crypto network. And so we obviously wanted to spin this off as a separate entity, or like that open source model can be fully leveraged, right? And that's the work of Akash. In 2017, we wrote the paper, and people really liked it. This was based on a tech that was sort of like already there, and we've been building it for like several years at that point. And when we first did our first prototype on Ethereum, then CryptoKitties launched. This was 2018. Ethereum really crashed, and then we were like, we have to go L1 because infrastructure is extremely mission critical, and we can't rely on Ethereum, which was unreliable. Even till date, it's kind of unreliable. And when we were like looking at what kind of scheme you want for your consensus, proof of stake was the obvious answer. Like, we're not going to do proof of work. And how do you secure a proof of stake system is using a token. There's no other way to secure a proof of stake system. So that's when the token came about. And also the token added the incentives, right? The incentives to sustain the system. So token now, Akash token, is primarily used to secure Akash network, and also used to incentivize and payments and all kinds of good things. Now, as we evolve the system, the use case for Akash token evolves as well.
Okay, that makes sense. So, I mean, for people who aren't familiar, can you just kind of do like a high-level overview of Akash and the services that it's providing? I mean, we've kind of talked about how you got there, but just like what it does today, or even what you plan for it to do in the next, near future.
In the actual term for what Akash does is it's called a super cloud, right? So Akash is super cloud in the sense that it aggregates various heterogeneous resources to give a homogeneous interface to make it easy to deploy, easy to manage, easy to secure, easy to do a lot of things across different servers. And it promises sovereignty, but at scale, in the sense that, and like we talked, when you give your applications to Amazon, they control you, and the costs are extremely high. The way you control your costs is to own your own data center, and that's been a trend that's actually heating up quite a lot now. But the challenge with like bringing your own data centers is underutilization. You're not going to use most of the time, because you have to, when you bring your own data center, you have to perform at peak loads, right?
Yeah,
so your peak loads vary. Yeah. If you like for example, if you like TurboTax, right? Like, Atlassian, the company, so not Atlassian, the TurboTax company, whoever is it, Atlassian? Could be someone. The company that runs TurboTax, essentially, during tax season, they have like peak loads, right? Especially on April 15th, they have like 90% of their servers being used, but most of the time they're only using like maybe 15-20%, right? So you always want that peak capacity because it takes time to put a server in a data center. So how do you justify that cost is by using Akash, right? So Akash is really, really good to go sovereign, bring your own data center, and sell that unused capacity on Akash when you're not using them. And when you want more capacity, you can tap in to the wider network. So it's a much better way to run a cloud. So it's a completely unique way on how do you look at deploying your own data center, right? So at the core of Akash, it has an incredible deployment mechanism, a multi-cloud mechanism, very modern, very open source. At the same time, it has a marketplace, a reverse auction marketplace that lets you acquire resources at a market rate, which is usually 80% cheaper than what you would otherwise pay for Amazon, right? Wow. And that's just true market price, right? Just true demand supply. It's also, open secret. No, it's not open secret, but I think it's pretty open financially. Like Amazon's Amazon's overall margins on AWS is about 40%. On
I
EC2,
didn't
the
know that.
compute instances, it's about 90%, right? And this is all public data, right? And it's
Wow.
crazy how much money they make. And Amazon's not known for their profit taking. They're traditionally known for their aggressive growth mode, right? So
Yeah.
AWS alone is valued over $500 billion, just the AWS business, right? And
Jeez.
it's extremely profitable. So instead of making Uncle Jeff rich, let's put some money back into making sure companies can survive, especially in this market. So Akash is a great way to get sovereignty at scale.
Okay. So what was the process for you guys when growing your company of getting the providers to sign on? Was that like an easy sell, or, did you have to kind of convince them? Like, how do you get people to put their compute availability into the Akash network?
When we were closed source software before, it was very hard because people wouldn't trust closed source software. If you can't look under the hood, especially infrastructure, you have no idea what's going on. So it's very important for us to go open source, and that increased trust. Right now, our closure rate for data centers is like 98, 99%. Like,
wow,
very few data centers we are unable to close, and not because lack of value prop, it's because of just mundane bureaucracy, right? So we got a large companies, they're like, oh, they move slow. But people are moving quite a lot now, especially like as we are getting to the next phase of Akash with GPUs. So there's quite a lot of Ethereum miners that were mining Ethereum Classic, the proof of stake, proof of work networks, now looking for a new home because all those GPUs are unused, right? So, and GPUs serve a very important type of workload called machine learning or artificial intelligence. It's AI and chat GPT and all this like new tech is getting a lot more popular. The demand for GPUs is just exponentially growing. So we have at least, I think, like the top two of the top five miners, proof of work miners now on Akash. And it's just getting a lot more. So it's very easy for us to get the supply. The demand, however, is a little more challenging than supply, and that's because it requires quite a lot of behavioral change, right?
So talk about that and where you are in that process, because from what I had listened to in your other interviews, it sounded like you prioritized composability over ease of use initially. And so you needed to be sort of more of an advanced developer to build with Akash, but that you were working on, I think over this last year, making that more turnkey. Is that
correct?
Is that still in process, or where is that?
Yes. Yeah. So when we designed Akash, we wanted to build an extremely powerful system, a system that allows a advanced developer to do incredible things that are not possible using your traditional cloud, like composability, for example, right? I want to be able to deploy to 100 clusters in a matter of minutes, and I want to be able to compose my workload in a way to address that, right? So we built it to be extremely powerful. And when you have to build software to be that powerful, you have to make trade-offs in terms of verticalization or generalization, right? So to make something easy, you got to verticalize, and that means you got to make compromises in terms of user experience. That means you got to drop certain things in order to make it super simple, because infrastructure is extremely complicated. So we didn't want to drop capabilities for usability, right? And so I mean, it's just like driving an F1 car. Like your F1 car is a lot more powerful than your Prius, but a lot more harder to drive an F1 car than a Prius, right? Just the nature of the game. So there's always trade-offs you need to make. There's no shortcuts to that, right? So we built the platform for developers with an understanding that we're going to have ecosystem come up with simpler ways to use, and rightfully so, it happened, right? So we have Speron, we have CloudMoss, we have now Fleek. Fleek is a very popular Web3 based deployment software. They're almost done with the integration for Akash. They provide the user experience and the verticalization that requires that's needed for Akash to sort of like get into, more developers that are looking for much better user experience, right? Like Akash doesn't give that user experience. It's very, very good if you're doing advanced things, but it's not so great if you're doing simple things like hosting a website, for example, right? There are much better solutions out there. And unfortunately, a lot of the solutions are centralized, like Vercel or Netlify and those things. And there's no real, Fleek is probably the best, like decentralized and like the most optimal user experience. So them integrating Akash is a really good sign.
They just reached out to us recently, actually, so I've been interested to check them out because it sounded like a cool kind of piece of the Web3 stack. But I was wondering about how you see things, because you sort of had to have specialized skills at the beginning of the web when you were building websites, right? So you've sort of seen this process play out once before, where you kind of have to move from hard mode into, an interface that has buttons that are easy to push and things that are easy to understand. And that just brings in like this whole new wave of people who are contributing their talent and their creativity and their intellect, but not necessarily, in that kind of like nitty gritty of just like bashing the thing together, right?
Yeah.
And so what do you think from where we stand now in the crypto industry and in particularly in the infrastructure side of things?
So I think like usability is getting solved so rapidly, especially with AI, ChatGPT.
That's cool. That's
and
exciting.
Very, very soon you're going to see. I mean, right now I write a lot of code, and my mode right now is I don't even click buttons. I write a comment, and the code gets written for me. Right? I tell what I want, what I'm thinking in terms of the logic and the inputs and outputs. The code gets written. So very soon you're going to see Akash like composability happen through a chat, right? And so I think capabilities is mind blowing. Yeah. So the user experience is not going to be a factor that's going to be limiting for decentralized applications. I think I've seen Solidity contracts. I've seen WASM contracts and a whole lot of things getting written by GPT. Capabilities are going to be crazy. And what's even more crazier is when AI writes code and Akash is unstoppable, and no one can stop AI from using Akash. Now that could go two ways. One way is like, yes, it's going to benefit humanity. Another way is going to create this unstoppable, internet for bots, And if you peel the onion, Akash means the sky in Sanskrit. Sky is where the clouds are formed, so that's where the name comes from.
Okay. I love that.
And if you convert that into English, it's Skynet.
Okay, I don't love that so much.
Sky Network. So it's it's an unstoppable Sky Network where AI writes code to serve other AI. So, but
not
I think now we have. But a very interesting thing is that since Akash is decentralized and has a governance model that's controlled by the token, people now have control over the supply of the future, right? So I think so AI is going to solve the UI problem, UX problem, and it will be governed by the people using the token. So I think the new Skynet is going to be very lovely, different.
Actually, yeah. Yeah. Okay. So would you kind of opine on that just a little bit further? Like what Web3 infrastructure is going to mean for all of us and, the future of the web and the governance aspect that you're talking about too? Because I know you're working toward that for Akash.
Right. So Web3 infrastructure really comes down, for me, it's personal, right? So for me, it's, I guess my values are shared by a lot of other people, but it really comes down to improving global efficiency, general, right? I think when you have systems like, there are like 7.2 million data centers in the world, right? Most of these data centers are not used. Imagine the kind of carbon emissions, imagine the kind of energy usage that's being just wasted right now. Like,
all the talk about how Bitcoin or crypto or whatever is wasteful. Nobody talks about how wasteful the current infrastructure is. given the kinds of issues that you're talking about, the amount of redundancy in the system, that none of these different services are, sharing their resources at all. And then also this aspect of like, they're only using a very small percentage of it, but they still have to keep the whole building cool, right? They still have to run all of those computers all of the times in case there's a spike in traffic. And so the infrastructure waste right now, I just think is so much higher than most people even, I don't think it's something that most people think about at all, because in the grand scheme of the costing structure, it's still a pretty small line item, like when like a content creator is like looking at all of their costs, the amount that they pay for their hosting is not like what's making or breaking them. And yet collectively, the amount of waste is stunning, and I think can be accelerated or efficientized or some word like that.
Really absolutely
dramatically.
So like I look at decentralization as a way to improve global energy efficiency for computational resources, just pure and simple, right? Like when you look at Amazons of the world, they're hyperscalers. They're building new data centers to expand. They're expansionary. They're outward looking. Whereas the Web3 and decentralization is inward looking at what we have already deployed. So if you go beyond data centers, just look at the compute that we have unused in our homes. Like I have a PlayStation and Xbox right behind me that's just sitting there. I probably use it once or twice a year, but just sitting there with these powerful GPUs. And the computers, your Macs have M1 chips, which are very powerful GPUs that are not used in the night, or but you're paying cooling for it. So there's a lot of underutilized resources that are spread globally that is using enormous amounts of energy that needs to be fixed, right? So Web3 is greener for me. Like Web3 is about efficiency and improving the global energy usage, efficiency, right? So second is sovereignty, right? If the moment we give up control, before you realize, the companies that have control get oligopolized in general industries, and then that stifles innovation, and you're no longer in control, right? It happens very slowly, but before you realize, it's too late and it's too hard, right? So improving sovereignty means giving back control to the people, right? Giving back control to me. I have my own servers. I should be able to use my own servers, right? And still not, at the same time, use it in a way that it's actually doesn't demand too much of my time, right? So making sovereignty, but making sovereignty usable, right? And three, removing, improving failure rates, right? Like just removing centralized points of failure.
Mm-hmm.
Like Amazon last year had over 100 outages, not because Amazon is bad tech. It's just because, behind the tech, there are people, right? Writing code, they're human beings, and human beings tend to make mistakes, especially when few people are making decisions for a lot of people. And those mistakes are a lot more amplified versus more people making decisions for themselves is a lot more contained. So it's important for just reducing the failure rates to be decentralized and as much distributed as possible, right? So those are the three things for me why decentralized infrastructure matters. And on top of that, if you add up all together, just the demand, right? So today we see, just talk about AI demand, right? So AI requires, if you break it down, AI has this two components called training and inference, right? So training demands are so high, it requires the latest and the greatest chips. And today we have something called NVIDIA Tesla A100s. These are specialized chips that are very, very attractive for AI training. They're very limited. So right now to get NVIDIA A100, it takes about 5 weeks wait time. And there's just not enough chips. And there are a lot of chips, like I think Amazon has about 20,000 of them. Facebook has 10,000. Stability AI has 4,000. So we all know where these chips are, right? It's right now, if you go to Amazon, you can't get A100s unless you pay them a lot of money, They're not going to give it to you. So the demand that limits companies from being able to do AI, right? So that means very few companies are going to control, whoever controls chips are going to control the one of the most important innovations that we have, AI, right? And that's not okay. Right? So and the demand is just increasing by tenfolds every 6 months, right? So to serve that demand, you need to decentralize, and you need to be able to. What that means is you need to be able to acquire these resources from whatever way you can and share these resources. Like there's no reason Facebook can share their resources with Stability AI and vice versa, right, when they're not using them, right?
Right. It's
I
just
don't
bad for
really
their
see
business
how we can
model.
solve. Yeah, so it helps them both, right? Facebook earns, I mean, these days there's a push towards more capital efficient models, right? It's no longer, we are in this like abundance, as much as abundance we had in terms of money. So people are looking at ways to like save money. I mean, if you ask Elon Musk, he'll probably tell you a lot more how to optimize cash, right? So people are going to look at like, how do you really reuse our space? It'd be great if like Twitter is doing AI, for them to be able to sell their underutilized capacity to Facebook, right? There's no reason, and do so in a way that is going to be decentralized and you don't require trust. So I think decentralization is an amazing way for competitors to cooperate. That's another area that was it's a very interesting like property of decentralized systems. Like you don't.
It is. That's a great point. Yeah. Right now, the model is sort of like you need to dominate the market, right? You don't want to go into a space that has competitors, according to Peter Thiel, right? Like you want to just be the monopoly. And yet we know from the early web that the co-opetition, that the cooperative, but also competitive sort of nature means that there ends up being a diversity of offerings to kind of like better meet different needs of the market. And I think that's really exciting because the web has so much potential, but where it is right now isn't serving a lot of people. A lot of people are really frustrated by it. The awareness about how broken the infrastructure is, I think, is really high. Like you're saying, there's just a tremendous amount of need for it. But I'm very excited to see how that's going to play out and what that's going to turn into, in terms of where Web3 goes.
Yeah. So I think and look at all the protocols that are part of the Web3 Working Group, like all of the protocols, Lightyear, Graph, RV, and us, and others are about sharing underutilized resources. And that's the foundation of Web3, right? So, and if you build abstractions on top of it, like looking at Fleek, that's actually building on top of RV and Akash, right, is what gets to the end user and makes it easy for end users to adopt Web3 systems. And it's just going to get better and better and better. I think the key and the important part and the critical part moving forward for Web3 is going to be how evolution happens, right? Like what is the future of Akash? Who writes the code? What is the future of Lightyear, or who writes the code of RV and whatnot?
So I was hoping you could talk more about that and what you're planning for Akash, because we were kind of talking about that before we started rolling, but it sounds like you have some really interesting ideas, and these are things that just need to be kind of figured out as we go, I suppose. So I'd love to hear about your guys' plans.
Yeah, so when we talk about decentralization, I think we got to talk about full stack decentralization, the entire decentralization, all the way from sure, how the protocol operates and how the governance happens, to how does evolution happen, who updates the code, where does the code sit down, right? Like I think when we talk about decentralization today, it's mostly quasi-decentralization. There's still like corporations behind decentralized protocols that control or contribute quite a lot or have a lot of influence on where the protocol goes. That I think is one of the biggest attack vectors, especially when regulation is heating up. And regulators, when they look at projects, they don't look at projects from the execution standpoint, but they really look at the origin, right? So there's a lot of attack vectors today. You have regulation, you have evolution, you have survivability. All these boil down to how decentralized really is a protocol, right? So if you peel the layers, you'll notice, most structures are, even with Ethereum, as a matter of fact, right? You have Ethereum Foundation, which coordinates all the sort of updates, right? And has control over the GitHub, right? Who does a pull request ultimately decides what goes into the main software, right? So there's always some central lock that it becomes attack vector. So I think it's very important for systems to remove those attack vectors. So, and what we're doing with Akash is an interesting model where we're going completely community first, right? Now, it's going to be progressive decentralization, but we start off with thinking about how do we prioritize a roadmap, because that's where really it begins, right? Like what features go into what versions of Akash and when they go, and who gets to decide what features go. So we start off with something called special interest groups, where, if you are a miner that want to optimize Akash for more mining, or if you're an AI company or AI workloads who are more GPUs, but you want specialized features around GPUs, so storage, or if you have even a token holder, you want to see more economics, right? You want to see how governance happens. You want to see how funding happens. So, all these special interest groups are open, right? All the discussions happen in a completely open setting. In fact, in a public setting, right? And these meetings are recorded and published, and anyone can participate into these groups. And then they get into as a deliverable for these like special interest groups would be something called a SIG, or a spec, which is essentially a specification.
Okay.
And from the specification, they end up with another vertical groups called working groups that actually go, complete the feature and code the feature. And the incentives are for the SIG is pre-direct incentives, in the sense that in order to participate in this work in the special interest group, you're not getting tokens or any of that direct incentives, but you already need to be using Akash, and you have a special interest in optimizing Akash to your needs. So you already have an incentive of walking in, right?
Okay. So it's similar to like the W3C, in that it's just like people who have a shared interest in a particular aspect of something coming together to work out how they can best.
Correct. And we're inviting everybody. We're inviting Google, Microsoft,
awesome.
Amazon, as well as CloudMoss and Speron, everybody, right? Like everybody, big and small, and that's very, very important for the success of these special interest groups. So it's going to be the first time I think something at this scale has been done, and something of this nature, in the sense like, yes, the reason for Akash to exist is to solve the Amazon and Google problem, but in order for us to solve the problem, they need to be part of the conversation. And that's where it becomes very unique and very different than your traditional working groups or SIGs. So it's an experiment for sure. I have a lot of confidence this is going to work out. Because, if you actually talk to like a lot of the companies like Amazon's, they acknowledge the problem. But they don't have a solution, because it's not the companies are evil, it's just the way the system is set up.
Right.
Reward centralization more than decentralization.
Yeah.
But there hasn't been an effort thus far to really bring people together and in an open setting and solve the problem collectively, right? So this open model lets us do that. It's very, very important to bring everybody to the table. So. And now you have who develops a feature, right? So that you have more direct incentivization, because now you're actually, asking people's time away from what they're, what they would be doing otherwise, that maybe, they earn for their living and whatnot. So there is some amount of incentivization that pays the bills. That comes directly from the protocol. Governed by an open board, right? So it's on chain. There's a governance proposal that goes into who gets the funding, and there is a public, auditable, accountable model where public can directly quote like, where did this go, right? So that's the foundations of an early
It's super interesting because it's like marrying, like, it's like, most open source things have had to just kind of, have some sort of donation plan or be a nonprofit, or, there've been, the irony of where we find ourselves in terms of the web and the internet today is that almost everything runs on open source at the foundational level. And yet there hasn't been a way to fund it. And so some things have dominated and done okay just because out of sheer necessity. And then those larger companies building their silos on top sometimes put resources toward maintaining that infrastructure, that open source infrastructure. But there hasn't been a mechanism where the infrastructure itself could fund itself. And that's really interesting.
Yes, self-sustenance is very, very important to ensure these special interest groups don't get a leg up, right? And I've seen that happen quite a lot with Kubernetes and whatnot. So you'll end up, because there's no direct incentivization for work, you end up with companies donating their free time, and they're not doing out of virtue. They're doing it because they want profits. It's not wrong to want profits. That's how the system is set up. It's not. They're not evil to want profits, right? I mean, without profits, they can't pay for this stuff. So we got to change that. And I think the way that we do that is to have protocol directly fund with openly governed mechanism, right? So it's definitely an experiment. So nothing like this has been done before. And as far as my knowledge, and especially at this scale, right? So I'm very, very excited. We're with this open model, I'll be talking in depth in my very shortly. So and another beautiful thing is a lot of the updates now. We're in 2023 called the build market, and so a lot of our content is going to be on how we are building. So far, it's been not as transparent as I'd like it to be, right? So it's been quite opaque in the sense that only transparency you get is from a GitHub, but it's also cryptic, right? You look at GitHub pull requests, is like, without having the context, it's very hard to sort of like understand a pull request. So the open model is going to optimize for more clarity for non-developers and non-technical folks as to how we are progressing overall. And I'm particularly excited because I love open source software and I want to do fully open source. And there's nothing in Akash that we do that interacts with the user will be closed source ever. So at Overclock, we still have some closed source software that's internal tooling, but nothing that touches the user is ever closed source. And that's the future that I want to build. So I'm really awesome. Yeah.
So what do you need in terms of the regulatory landscape in order to support you being able to create this open source infrastructure?
We want regulators to look under the hood a lot more as to, so let me back up. So it's more than evident, there's quite a lot of fraud in crypto in world, right? So that be it centralized, be it decentralized, but the whole crypto is being looked at as a single entity, or Web3 is being looked at as a single entity, and there's very sort of like little difference that people understand from the outside between FTX and a Uniswap. And that's sad.
Yeah, it's really sad.
It's really sad. Yeah. So first thing we want regulators to clearly, and legislators, right, to clearly draw the difference. No, FTX is a company versus Uniswap is a protocol. So let's start off there. Like, what's decentralized, what's not decentralized? Once we start looking at decentralized systems, let's look at, well, how is it really decentralized, right? Is it a company? Who's creating software? Who's benefiting out of the software? And how is the software updated? How is it governed, right? If you look at FTX token or FTT token versus something like a Uniswap token, right? Like FTT token is clearly hyper controlled by FTX. It was really, if you look at the utility, was to give discount on FTX, right? Like, so it is a token created as a way to capture value. It's very clear. And beyond like discounted fees, there's really no other utility. Discount is not a utility, right? There's no
Like
governance. There's none.
or something. Yeah,
exactly. When there's no governance, there's no openness. There's nothing that it's not a consensus protocol. It doesn't secure the chain. So I think people need to start looking at like, well, who is it benefiting, and not benefiting in the sense like, well, is it paying their bills? Is paying like people's bills to improve the software? I mean, I'm talking about like benefiting without a utility, right? Like pure benefit, right? And so we want regulators to regulate these things. We really want, but we want to make sure that these are very important points that people need to look at: the decentralization, right? And we want protection, right? I mean, it's not okay if FTX happened. Like, that's not okay, because that hurts us, all of us. And we pay taxes. We participate in the democracy. We want protection, but not but we don't want to be clubbed with everybody, centralized and decentralized. I think that's a starting point. What we want from regulators, and a lot of the stuff is when you get into tactical, when you get into like individual like feature, like capabilities, like the fact that we can't sell tokens online, that limits our users to be able to use Akash network, things of that nature, right? I think there are a lot of problems that could be solved from a legislative standpoint that'll help decentralization, right? So, and I think it all begins with like legislators and regulators embracing decentralization first, and really looking at like how can you help, right? So and looking at the benefits, like, well, decentralization is important for better energy usage, right? Things of that nature, right? How can you improve energy usage is by allowing for decentralization to happen, right? Not restricting it. So I think the regulators and legislators need to understand that yes, this is truly potential. There's a lot of limitations right now that's preventing decentralization from happening. If you remove those limitations, what can you see? I think it's very important. So first, like, just don't impede on progress by
but also take some of those limitations out of the way. I think that's a good point, that because it's so murky right now, it's hard to know which things apply, and so then you end up just kind of having to assume everything applies to be on the safe side and then that becomes a huge hindrance to what's possible.
And also, like, look at, well, so clearly decouple infrastructure from the rest, right? Like, when we talk about Web3, people talk about DeFi and NFTs.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like,
financial
there's this whole industry called infrastructure. We are trying to, improve, energy consumption. If you think about it, if you really peel the layers, it's actually part of the agenda,
right,
for the policymakers. So we are playing into the agenda, right? So people don't really understand that, and I think without understanding that, trying to regulate it is unfair, right? We're not trying to improve your financial or make you more money. We're not trying to,
like be a bank,
sell you art. We're not trying to be literally trying to build a greener earth, right? Like, right. So and like make it more cheaper for people to participate in this world of cloud, right? And I think people need to understand that needs to really drive down that point. And once people understand that, I think it'll be a lot more easier to look at decentralized products.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right. Well, the name of the series is What Kind of Internet Do You Want? So that's the question we like to ask at the end of every interview. What kind of internet do you want? I know we've mostly been talking about it for this whole time, but just a quick little, something opine.
For me, the internet that I want needs to be sovereign, needs to be private, needs to be decentralized, and needs to be efficient. right? That's the internet that I want. But
Great answer.
sovereignty, yeah, is the foundation.
Yeah, it's really where it started too, its roots. So that makes sense. I love that. Okay, well, thank you so much. This was fantastic.
Awesome.